Most people look at the classic avoidant attachment style as the ultimate relational fortress. You know the archetype: cold, fiercely independent, completely unbothered by emotional distance. They are the ones who walk away when things get deep, leaving a trail of anxious, confused partners behind them. They play the game of psychological chess with a massive advantage because they simply don't care as much. Or at least, that is the lie they tell themselves. And for 99% of the population, that fortress holds. It keeps people out. It keeps the avoidant entirely in control of the emotional thermostat. But there is a rare psychological anomaly, a specific variant of the empathic personality spectrum that doesn't just bypass the avoidance defenses, it completely dismantles them. This isn't your standard people-pleasing empath who begs for affection and feeds the avoidance need for power. No, this is the dark empath, specifically the high-caliber analytical empath. When an ordinary avoidant encounters this specific individual, the power dynamic doesn't just shift, it reverses entirely. The typical behavioral cues the avoidant uses to maintain control, the silent treatment, the subtle emotional withholding, the micro-rejections, are weaponized against them. The analytical empath doesn't get triggered by the distance. Instead, they read the distance like a text. They look past the cold veneer and isolate the exact childhood wound driving the behavior. They see the micro-expressions of fear masked as indifference. What happens next is a masterclass in psychological inversion. Because this empath type understands behavioral mechanics, they don't chase, they anchor. They mirror the avoidance space with absolute calm, completely neutralizing the avoidance primary defense mechanism. For the first time in their life, the avoidant is forced to look into a mirror that reflects their deepest vulnerabilities, without any of the familiar emotional noise they use to justify running away. It is a psychological checkmate. If you have ever wondered why some avoidants can walk away from incredible people without shedding a tear, yet completely lose their minds, break their own rules, and end up begging for a second chance from someone else, this is the hidden blueprint. Over the next few minutes, we are going to strip away the surface-level relationship advice and look at the raw operational psychology behind why this one specific empath type is the only force on the planet capable of bringing a committed avoidant to their knees. If you miss even one of the behavioral triggers we are about to break down, you will completely misunderstand how deep human programming really goes. Pay attention, because the dynamics of control are never what they appear to be. Look at the person who always walks away. The one who uses silence like a scalpel, cutting off communication the second things get vulnerable. In behavioral profiling, we don't look at that as strength. We look at it as a highly rigid, predictable script. The avoidant partner believes they are holding all the cards because they can tolerate isolation better than you can. They feed on your anxiety. Your panic confirms their safety. But right now, I am going to introduce you to the predator of that specific defense mechanism. The one person who makes the avoidant's entire psychological playbook completely useless. If you listen to this entire breakdown today, you are going to see exactly how human programming can be flipped on its head. You will understand the hidden operational flaws inside the avoidant mind and why a very specific type of empath doesn't just survive an avoidant, they completely restructure them. If you skip even a part of this, you will continue to play the anxious avoidant trap forever, completely blind to the exit door. Let's look at the baseline. The average person encounters an avoidant and tries to fix the distance with warmth. They send the extra text. They demand explanations. Every single one of those actions is data. To the avoidant subconscious, that data says, I am still in control. I am the prize. I am safe from engulfment because I can push them away at will. Enter the analytical empath. This isn't the empath who absorbs your energy and cries in the corner. This is an individual with high cognitive empathy. They don't just feel what you feel, they map it. They observe baseline behavior, vocal tonality, and fluid shifts in body language. When the avoidant pulls back, the analytical empath doesn't experience an emotional spike. Their heart rate stays steady. Their pupil dilation remains normal. They don't see a threat, they see a mechanism resetting. What happens when a machine doesn't get the expected input? It errors out. When the avoidant pulls away, expecting the standard chase, the analytical empath gives them absolute echoing silence. But it isn't the angry, passive-aggressive silence of a narcissist. It is a calm, unbothered, completely supportive space. The empath effectively says, "Oh, you need space? Perfect. Take all of it." This completely disrupts the avoidant's predictive processing. Suddenly, the distance they created doesn't feel like a fortress anymore. It feels like an isolation cell. The dopamine hit they usually get from being chased evaporates. For the first time, the avoidant is left alone with the one thing they have spent their entire lives running from: themselves. The analytical empath knows that avoidance is just a historic survival adaptation. It's an old software program written in childhood to protect a kid whose needs were rejected or ignored. Because this empath operates with surgical emotional intelligence, they don't argue with the avoidant's surface-level excuses. When the avoidant says, "I'm just too busy for a relationship right now," the average person argues the logic. The analytical empath looks at the micro-expressions, the brief fraction of a second asymmetry in the face, the downward shift in vocal pitch, and they see the underlying terror of unworthiness. When they speak, they don't speak to the avoidance mask. They speak directly to the wound underneath, using language so precise and disarming that the avoidance psychological firewall collapses. They might say something as simple and devastatingly calm as, "You don't have to perform or pull away to prove you're safe here. I'm not going to trap you." This completely breaks the avoidance internal logic. They have spent their entire lives building a defense system against people who want to consume them or people who will abandon them. They have absolutely zero defense mechanisms against someone who completely understands them, requires nothing from them, yet remains entirely unshakable. The power dynamic shifts irreversibly. The avoidant, who previously took weeks to respond, begins to experience a hyperfixation. The uncertainty flips. They start checking their phone. They start analyzing the empath's behavior, looking for a flaw, a sign of weakness, a hint of anxiety. But they find nothing but a calm, steady mirror. Eventually, the pressure of their own suppressed emotions builds up. The avoidance fortress becomes their prison, and the only way out is through the door the analytical empath is holding open. They don't just come back. They return stripped of their ego, ready to communicate, completely brought to their knees by the one force they couldn't run away from: absolute, seen-through understanding. To truly understand why the avoidant attachment style is so easily dismantled by a high-caliber analytical empath, we have to first strip away the myth of their emotional independence. In the world of behavioral profiling, there is a massive difference between genuine emotional autonomy and a highly rigid, hypervigilant defense system. The casual observer looks at an avoidant individual, someone who can cut off a relationship in 24 hours, who utilizes the silent treatment with surgical precision, and who seems completely unbothered by emotional distance, and concludes that this person possesses a unique kind of psychological strength. They look like an unshakable fortress. But if you analyze the baseline metrics of human behavior, you quickly realize that a fortress is not a sign of absolute power. A fortress is a monument built out of absolute terror. The independent exterior that the avoidant presents to the world is actually a fragile, highly predictable behavioral mirage. It is a protective shell designed to keep people at a safe distance because the internal infrastructure cannot handle the weight of genuine vulnerability. This entire system relies on a very specific, repeatable script. It operates on the assumption that the people they encounter will react to their withdrawal in a highly predictable way. When an avoidant pulls back, the standard human script dictates that the partner will experience a massive spike in anxiety. The partner will text more, demand explanations, beg for reassurance, and exhibit frantic chasing behavior. To the subconscious mind of the avoidant, this chase is the ultimate safety metric. It provides them with an immense amount of operational data. Every panicked text message and emotional plea from their partner confirms two things to the avoidant's internal software. First, that they are completely safe from being suffocated or trapped because they have successfully established distance. And second, that the partner is still safely anchored to them and isn't going anywhere. This creates a deeply distorted dopamine reward loop where the avoidant feels incredibly powerful and secure precisely because they are causing someone else to panic. They use your emotional dysregulation to regulate themselves. It is a game of psychological chess where they always hold the advantage because they have convinced themselves that they simply care less. However, because this behavior is completely reactionary rather than autonomous, it is fundamentally weak. The entire independent persona is an illusion that completely depends on the partner playing the role of the chaser. If you remove the chaser from the equation, the avoidant's illusion of strength instantly begins to fracture. Their independence is not a self-sustaining power source. It is an echo chamber that requires the noise of your anxiety to feel solid. When they encounter an individual who does not provide that noise, who does not follow the predictable script, the structural integrity of the avoidance armor is put to the test for the first time. Without the validation of your pursuit, the cold, unbothered exterior begins to warp into profound confusion. They are exposed to the raw reality that their defense system is entirely hollow, built not on self-sufficiency, but on a desperate, lifelong avoidance of their own deep-seated fears of unworthiness and rejection. They realize that the walls they built to keep the world out have actually trapped them inside a very small, very lonely room, completely defenseless against someone who can see the fragile child hiding behind the massive stone walls. To understand the precise point of failure in the avoidant psychological defense system, we must dissect the unique weapon system that is the high-caliber analytical empath. In standard psychological discourse, empaths are almost universally painted as highly sensitive, deeply emotional people-pleasers who absorb the energy of a room and lose themselves in the needs of others. That is the classic emotionally reactive empath, and to an avoidant, that type of person is an easy target, someone whose anxiety can be easily exploited to maintain control. But the analytical empath belongs to an entirely different taxonomic category of human behavior. This is an individual who possesses an extraordinary capacity for emotional intelligence, but who processes that emotional data through a matrix of cold, cognitive logic. They do not just feel your emotional state, they decode it. They look at human interaction not as an emotional whirlpool to drown in, but as a complex web of behavioral mechanics subtext, and operational baselines. While a standard empath feels an avoidance withdrawal as a painful rejection and reacts with frantic panic, the analytical empath observes that same withdrawal as a shift in behavioral telemetry. Their pulse does not skyrocket, their breathing remains steady, and their internal sense of security stays completely level because they do not take the avoidance distancing behavior personally. Instead, they view it as a highly predictable systemic response to intimacy. This specific psychological makeup grants them an almost predatory advantage over the avoidance standard playbook. Because they process emotional data cognitively, they are completely immune to the emotional smokescreens that avoidants use to protect themselves. When an avoidant deploys the silent treatment, drops cold microexpressions, or utilizes passive-aggressive polling behaviors, the analytical empath reads these actions with the detached precision of a machine looking at lines of code. They instantly separate the avoidance defensive actions from the actual underlying reality of the situation. They recognize that the avoidant is not actually superior, indifferent, or strong. Rather, they see that the avoidant is engaged in a desperate, hyper-vigilant attempt to manage their own internal panic. This shift in perspective entirely flips the traditional power dynamic. The analytical empath operates with a level of extreme emotional sobriety that makes it impossible for the avoidant to bait them into a chase. They do not feed the avoidant's subconscious need for a frantic, anxious pursuit, which effectively starves the avoidance coping mechanism of its oxygen. By remaining perfectly anchored, calm, and intellectually observant, the analytical empath transforms the entire relationship dynamic into a clinical observation lab. They are able to map out the exact contours of the avoidance psychological architecture, identifying their triggers, their childhood programming, and their specific structural flaws, without ever allowing the avoidant to disrupt their internal peace. It is the ultimate synthesis of profound human insight and unshakable psychological stability, creating a conversational and behavioral environment where the avoidant's traditional tools of emotional evasion are rendered completely useless, leaving them utterly exposed to a mind that understands them far better than they understand themselves. The standard relational ecosystem of an avoidant operates entirely on an unspoken law of physics. For every action of withdrawal, there must be an equal and opposite reaction of pursuit. This is the dopamine reward loop of control that sustains their psychological equilibrium. When the avoidant pulls away, the subsequent chase from an anxious partner gives their brain a powerful chemical payoff, reinforcing their sense of safety and dominance. But when they deploy this exact strategy against a high-caliber analytical empath, they collide headfirst with a devastating psychological counter-strategy, the law of non-reaction. This mechanic completely short-circuits the avoidance predictive processing software. When the avoidant steps back into the shadows of their usual silence, expecting the predictable flood of frantic messages, tearful voice notes, or demands for clarity, they are met with absolute, unbothered, echoing silence. It is not a hostile silence, nor is it the calculated, passive-aggressive stonewalling often used in toxic power games. It is a calm, entirely supportive space. The analytical empath essentially grants the avoidant exactly what they claim they wanted, with zero friction. This absence of resistance completely breaks the avoidant's internal compass. In behavioral terms, human beings derive a massive sense of validation from the friction they create in others. If you pull on a rope and nobody pulls back, you instantly lose your balance. Without the anxious chase to validate their withdrawal, The distance the avoidant created doesn't feel like a position of power anymore. It suddenly feels like an isolation cell. The dopamine hit they normally receive from being pursued completely evaporates, replaced by a sudden, jarring vacuum. The avoidant's subconscious mind immediately errors out because the external reality no longer matches their internal script. They are left entirely alone with the one thing they have spent their whole lives running from, their own unedited thoughts and the terrifying void of their own internal emptiness. The law of non-reaction strips away the avoidant's ability to blame the partner for the breakdown of the connection. In normal dynamics, an avoidant can easily justify running away by pointing to their partner's frantic behavior and labeling them as crazy, needy, or smothering. This projection allows them to maintain the illusion that they are the healthy, rational one. But the analytical empath's absolute stability denies them this escape hatch. There is no drama to point to, no emotional dysregulation to weaponize, and no pressure to fight against. The empath's non-reaction acts as a flawless, unshakable mirror, reflecting the avoidant's internal panic directly back at them. As the days pass without a chase, the avoidant's initial relief mutates into a profound, creeping anxiety. They begin to realize that the doors to the fortress are wide open, yet no one is trying to force their way in. The terrifying realization sets in that while they thought they were exercising ultimate control by walking away, they were actually just allowed to leave without a fight. This complete inversion of expectations completely dismantles their psychological footing, causing the avoidant's internal defense system to collapse under the weight of its own uselessness, rendering them entirely vulnerable to the quiet power of a partner who cannot be manipulated into a chase. To understand how the high-caliber analytical empath penetrates the deepest layers of the avoidant's psychological armor, we must look at the mechanics of X-ray empathy and vulnerability mapping. For the average person, the avoidant's cold, independent mask is an impenetrable wall. They take the avoidant's dismissive statements and aloof body language at face value, assuming that the person genuinely does not care. But to the analytical empath, a mask is not a barrier, it is an active data stream. Because this empath operates with an elite level of behavioral tracking, they don't look at what the avoidant wants them to see. They look at the micro-behaviors that slip through the cracks of the performance. They observe the baseline of the individual, the precise pitch of their voice when a sensitive topic is raised, the subtle tension in the jaw muscles, the sudden fraction of a second asymmetry in a forced smile, and the fleeting downward shift in eye contact when genuine intimacy is offered. These are not random physical movements. They are leaking data points that reveal a highly active, deeply hidden state of internal panic. The analytical empath collects this data and uses it to map out the precise contours of the avoidant's historic childhood trauma. They know that avoidance is almost never a conscious choice. It is an ancient survival script written in early childhood to protect a vulnerable kid whose emotional needs were routinely rejected, ignored, or swallowed by an overwhelming caregiver. When the avoidant individual grows up and uses the phrase, "I am just too busy for a relationship right now," the average partner tries to argue the logistics of their schedule, completely wasting their breath. The analytical empath, however, bypasses the logical argument entirely. They look directly past the surface-level excuse and isolate the underlying childhood wound driving the behavior. The terrifying fear of being consumed, controlled, and ultimately abandoned. Armed with this hyper-precise psychological map, the analytical empath does something completely counterintuitive. They refuse to attack or fight the firewall. Instead, they speak directly to the hidden child beneath the armor, using language that is so disarmingly calm, clear, and devoid of emotional demands that the avoidant's psychological defenses completely lose their footing. They might look at the avoidant and say something as devastatingly simple and grounded as, "You don't have to perform or pull away to prove you're safe here. I am not going to trap you, and I am not going to chase you." This sentence is an operational masterpiece because it systematically disarms every single trigger the avoidance defense system is prepared to fight. It proves to the avoidance subconscious mind that this specific partner cannot be manipulated into a conflict, cannot be pulled into a toxic game, and most importantly, can see right through the tough exterior. For the first time in their life, the avoidant is placed in a behavioral matrix where their hiding spots have been entirely stripped away. They realize that the cold persona they have spent decades perfecting is completely transparent to this person. The profound shock of being truly seen, not judged, not criticized, and not begged, but deeply and accurately decoded, creates a massive breach in their emotional security system, leaving them completely exposed to a level of psychological intimacy they have spent their entire existence running from. The final phase of this psychological confrontation is the activation of the inversion matrix, the precise mechanical sequence where the avoidant transitions from a position of absolute emotional dominance to a state of complete hyperfixation and eventual surrender. In the initial stage of any relational fracture, the avoidant sits comfortably in the seat of the withholding partner. They have successfully deployed their silence, and their internal software assumes they dictate the emotional climate of the connection. But as the analytical empath's law of non-reaction takes hold, a profound algorithmic error occurs inside the avoidant's subconscious mind. The expected feedback loop of partner anxiety is entirely absent. This absence of data creates a severe psychological vacuum, and human nature abhors a vacuum. The avoidance brain, desperate to regain its equilibrium and prove that its defense mechanisms are still functioning, is forced to actively seek out the data it is missing. This is the exact moment the hunter becomes the prey. The avoidant begins to execute low-level investigative behaviors that they would normally consider entirely beneath them. They find themselves opening communication apps just to check the empath's active status, tracking social media updates for subtle emotional tells, or rereading old text messages to locate the exact moment they lost control of the behavioral narrative. Every search yields a flat baseline. The empath remains perfectly composed, unbothered, and entirely autonomous. This lack of response triggers an intense state of cognitive dissonance. The avoidant's primary cognitive framework dictates that they are the prize, the one who leaves, and the one who controls the emotional thermostat of the room. When the external reality continuously disproves this framework, their subconscious mind shifts